When we used to play D&D, we always used to say, God, D&D should be a movie.
It's great imagination. I mean, there's no way you could make one movie and use everything that's in that world.
First question was if I ever played the game, and I had, so it was a neat opportunity to start designing monsters and characters that I played with when I was a kid.
I had grown up in the film business in Toronto, and I was going to go to film school. But I learned it doesn't matter if you went to film school, because really you need to know somebody to get into the business, and the best experience you're going to have is just practically doing it and getting jobs.
Cut to a quick POV.
So I thought to myself, I need to make my own movie. But I didn't want to just go to Hollywood with a script.
Yeah, that's fine.
I was like working on a couple of different scripts, but I thought, you know, I don't want to just walk in with a script. One day a friend of mine was at my house, and he saw my old D&D books and took them out and started going through them. And it just occurred to me, let's make the D&D movie. You know, he was 19, so it was like, you know, a big joke. Well, I just followed through with it. I called up TSR and said, you know, I'd really like to try to get the rights to make a movie. He said nobody had the rights, told me a bit of history about people that had tried to get the rights and why there was no deal that had ever been done. So I said, well, could we set up a meeting? And he said, yes, they had some show in Vegas where I could go down and meet some of the executives. So I put together this whole proposal, bought my first business suit, had this meeting with them. One guy sat there staring at me like this the whole time, just staring at me, not saying anything to me at all. But they were impressed at the end of the meeting. And about 18 months later, we finally ended up signing a deal to have an option to the exclusive rights to make the movie.
I'm telling you, there's got to be some twisted magic experiment gone seriously wrong. I'd just love to find a way to give those mages some payback. What was exciting about doing the movie was you had this incredible canvas to pull from. You know, you got the thieves and the magic and different kinds of spells you can use, but you get freedom to move anywhere you want inside that world and use those characters in any way you want.
You're supposed to put some kind of holding spell with that bracelet!
I felt the movie had to be faithful to the rules of the game. The question was, how do you do it so that somebody who knows nothing about Dungeons and Dragons can still enjoy the movie all by themselves, you know, and not get bogged down in a whole bunch of technicalities. My thought was that it was better to take what I call the Star Wars approach.
The Empire of Israel.
Which is simply introduce to the audience that we're in a different world now, and this is the rough parameters of it, and then let the audience learn about that world and how it works through watching the movie, and watching the characters learn on the way.
I can't believe this! You better believe it, they're framing us.
No, it's an adventure story. It's about adventuring. You know, you got beholders and dragons.
Ridley, look. Beholders.
One thing is I wanted to see the best amount of creatures that I could, which I knew were the most popular ones, because every game I'd ever played in, people always kept using the same, you know, creatures. Like they'd use a whole variation, but there were ones that were always really popular.
The tricky part about translating the game for the film was it's been around so long, the images have really become icons. The trick was to take these standard images, make them recognizable, make them fresh again.
And that was probably the scariest thing for me, even in making the movie, because you try to make it as cool as possible and at the same time get in the middle of where everybody might want to see it. For certain creatures that are key creatures in the movie, like the dragons, the reds and the golds, first thing we do is, you know, look at the original drawing. Then I'd say, this is way off. It's got to be strong like this, big here, the scale's got to be huge, it can't look like this dragon or that dragon. I would give like all these descriptive things. So then Tully would do a drawing. He'd usually do 4 or 5 initially. And I'd go, you know, well, part of this one is good, part of that one is good, part of this one is good. Let's try to combine the good parts of those ones into a new one.
One thing that bothered me with a lot of the dragon designs that I'd seen before is they always looked like slow, ponderous, brontosaurus type creatures. It just bugged me. I wanted these dragons to be meaner and faster. So even though they're reptilian, there's a lot of sort of cat anatomy in there to let them have that real hostile, dangerous movement. And the gold dragon is a good dragon, and in the movie it fights on Empress's side. So it was important that it be very regal, still mean and threatening, but statuesque, royal guard, sort of a crown of horns, like a royal headdress. The red dragon are the nasty ones. They're like the mean pit bull type dragons. They're much more compact. They're a little smaller. Sharp things everywhere. A lot of horns and teeth and hooks made for tearing and stuff.
Once he got the approval on the artwork from me, then he would go and create the maquette. So now we had a 3D reference that we could then go show our visual effects houses so that they could scan that in and start on the wireframe for creating the internal skeleton of what these creatures would ultimately be at the end of the day.
Courtney wanted these things to look real as non-fictional characters as you can make them look. When the production company gives us the maquettes, which are clay models, we then will get them cyber scanned and then create a skeleton structure to move the creatures around.
Of course, translating a maquette into a living, breathing, photoreal dragon that you believe is really there is a whole other task unto itself.
Singer's eating something back there.
The main house that handled the dragons was Vision Art, and one thing that they have is great, which was really helpful for that opening scene I was talking about, is they have a motion capture stage. And so you'd get an actor in a costume, which would be hooked up, and there'd be like 8 special cameras that would touch certain sensors on him, and I could be standing at the monitor and it would look like he was a dragon at the scale we were looking for, standing in the room.
We had to use motion capture at the beginning of this because we wanted to previs a lot of what Corey wanted in the film. So what we did is designed a character that was, basically the same design as the dragon. It was very low res. And then we brought the character out into our stage, had a guy in a motion capture suit, and he would basically do performance art surrounding all of the character's movements.
And I could actually direct him to move the way I wanted the dragon to move, because in that scene, I wanted to sell that this dragon was very unhappy that it was being controlled by Prothean.
That was a unique piece to do because we had to create a complete CG environment. The whole dungeon that the dragon is in is completely CG, and it has to cut with live action. So what we did is, just like you would in a regular production, give it to the editor who cut the whole sequence together, and then we knew exactly what we needed to use and what pieces we needed to work on.
So you see nothing textured. You see like a silly animated broken up looking dragon in a silly room which looks like green on the background. You have no real feeling for perspective or anything else like that, and all you're doing is working on how they move. From that point, what they would do is then lock off on the wireframe and then do special keyed animation for things that wouldn't be handled in motion capture because motion capture is kind of sloppy. And you'd spend about 3-4 months just doing the subtlest things to make the dragon work the way you want it to. How it steps, how its body moves, how it breathes, what sort of facial animation there's going to be.
I told you it could be done.
One of the most interesting things about the dragon is that there's a lot of nuances that we're able to do now, where a simple thing of flaring a nostril or squinting an eye or having the stomach billow and breathe, that most people don't pick up and you don't really notice unless you really sit there and look at it. But it adds that little bit of touch of reality to it.
In the end scene, it was more complicated because there's several layers that needed to be added. In the end scene, the dragons are flying over a completely artificially created 3D CGI city.
We have shots with so many dragons. I've never done anything like that with so many characters in one particular shot. There's one shot in which have something like 13 hero dragons, so that was a logistical nightmare.
We created our own software package, what we're calling flocking, where we would hand animate only a few of the dragons, and then we can apply it to multiple dragons. Basically say, I want these 10 dragons to fly from point A to point B, and we can put obstacles in their path. And then the computer software just goes, and it's intelligent enough to fly that path, avoid obstacles, and then also not collide with each other. And what that did was we were able to animate 75 to 100 dragons flying around back and forth and fighting each other without having to hand animate each one.
There's a chase through the city in which we dive and we fly through buildings. I think that was, for me, it was the most interesting.
A lot of people map out animation shots differently. There's keyframing, but there's also key events that you want to hit, kind of almost like hitting your mark. The way I animate is I choose a few important parts of the animation, and then I kind of just animate freely and see what happens. Sometimes I just throw in keyframes and you just come upon something that's unique. So you have to be rigid up until a point, and then you have to loosen up and see what works.
The other hard part was there's a lot of action and interaction between the main characters because this is the climax of the movie. The characters were actually placed on the tallest building in Sumdal. So what we had done is we had to build this like 50-foot in diameter set which represented the balcony of the top of the highest point in the city of Sumdal. If we wanted to shoot from the outside, we actually had to shoot every shot on a crane. The blue screens everywhere had to be filled with the dragons fighting in the sky behind the characters that were interacting with each other on this set. Those were really hard because it was like a movie within a movie and everything had to match with the hero dragon shots.
People don't understand the effects are actually a very difficult thing to work with because they're not there. And there's no semblance of them there either. It's not like they're partially there. There's nothing there.
Of force of some kind. I've never seen this kind of magic.
To Corey's credit, what he did with all of us was he gave us a very clear understanding of what was going to be there. What is it?
It's a wall of force of some kind. I've never seen this kind of magic.
George Gibbs built the maze, and George Gibbs is an Oscar-winning effects guy who worked on Star Wars and Indiana Jones. And he's the best. I mean, he really is the best. That was a pretty hairy sequence. We go through the first room, and there's lots of axes in there. Those are all suspended on a rigging above the set, and that rigging is made out of steel. And those axes are made basically out of steel, and the actual axe itself is wood, tipped with styrofoam. But the axes themselves weigh 300, 400 pounds. And when they drop them, it's just inertia. So, you know, there's a brake on there, but you can't break those axes fast enough to stop it on the way down. It'll take 2 or 3 rotations before the axes actually stop. And we were doing one shot where I put my hand into the light and I trigger the axe and I turn around and it comes down at me and I jump out of the way. And we'd done this 3 or 4 times. And what was happening is the axe wasn't entering frame before I was leaving frame. I said to Corey, I said, it's okay, but it would probably be better if I was in the frame with the axe. And Corey looked at me and went, yeah, that would be better. Let's figure out how to do that. And I put my hand in the light, and when they let it go, it was coming at me so fast I had no time to think. I didn't have time to react. I don't even know how I moved. I just, if you watch it, I just kind of come off my tippy toes and get out of the way. But we got it, and when they finally cut, I hear, it's great, it's great, it's great.
The rug thing was an element in the movie where Snails was breaking into Damodar's chamber after Damodar had actually gotten the map with the location of the Rod of Savril. And as he was walking towards it, there was supposed to be a trap right in front of where it was sitting, which is a quicksand rug, which would suck him into oblivion, basically. We had contemplated doing the rug CG, but George said, no, I can do this. So we dug out the floor for about 8 feet, put this little lift that would be up. There was a certain spot Marlon was to step on. When he stepped on it, he'd actually be stepping on the lift. And then the lift would immediately start to lower, thereby sucking him into the quicksand, which was really 6,000 pounds of oatmeal. It was really an ingenious little trap.
The film was shot in and around Prague. There's such wonderful architectures, very medieval, very Baroque, which have, in a way, another worldly sort of quality to them. For example, in the Empress's Chapel.
But how could he get the council to turn against me?
In the Opera House, which we used as the council hall.
Your loyalty is commendable.
And there were the Strahov Library locations, which were the laboratory and study room for the magic school.
I never saw a scroll so hard to decode.
The other location that worked very well for us was called the Bone Chapel. It's in a town called Koznitsia, about 2 hours from Prague. And this chapel is entirely decorated with human bones. These were people who were exhumed some years after the plague, at their request apparently. And then in the 19th century, an artist came to the chapel and devised these very interesting architectural fixtures from these human bones.
And see our friend Vilda.
We really wanted to bring a layering of many centuries and many cultures to Sumdal and the world of D&D overall, something that was at once familiar and unfamiliar and a little unusual.
The city that we were creating to tell you you were in another world is not a real city, it's a fantasy city.
In order for you to believe the story, you have to abort the city. You have to look at it and believe that this is a tangible place. Almost every single shot starts as a watercolor. That's then scanned in, and then it's used as a template for either a full 3D environment or a 2D matte shot.
And once that's finalized with the director, we go ahead and build a really, really rough 3D version with lots of camera motion, with some attempt to do lighting, but primarily for motion. And that is the animatic phase of doing it. The next stage after doing the animatic and having, doing the different tweaks to the motion and the lighting and the model is to go ahead and start producing textures, because that's the main thing that's missing. For the Profian's Castle shot, we went to the concept art that the art department supplied us, which is really cool looking, which had one particular image of the Chicago Tribune building, which helped us to identify, in a more detailed way what the detailed look of the building would be. And so you see actually both of those images right here. Basically all the textures come in one form or another from photographs. We have tons of books on Gothic architecture, and we'd scan different pieces of different buildings that we liked, where the lighting was such that it would function well as a texture. And it's really like collage, It's too much work to invent this stuff completely from scratch. So this is the final shot. A lot of hours went into putting this thing together. It was not easy on the machines. It takes forever to render, but we hope that it's worth it.
The Empire of Innsmouth is divided between two classes. I really wanted Ridley and Snails, who come from the lower echelon, to be reflective of thieves, because that's what they are.
They're both thieves, so they have to be light and agile, so there's no heavy armor, nothing that'll draw attention to them.
I wanted Ridley to have little elements of Luke Skywalker, the high boots, fairly basic, tattered, clothing. It's kind of like an Oliver Twist type of look. Same with Marlon as Snails, except the difference is his character is just a fun-loving, good soul. So his costume had to be a little bit more messy and sloppy than Ridley's costume, because he always turns everything into comedy. On the other side, to define the differences between the rich and the poor, really, in this world, their costumes are silky and velvety and have jewels on them. That would really be for the Empress. The mages you see in the Council of Mages, they're the aristocracy.
In the scene in the council chamber where she's arguing with Profian, she has a dragon bone headdress coming up from her back. And a lot of the parts of her dress are plated like scales. She's addressing her state, and the gold dragon's being her state dragon. It's all incorporated into her costume.
Damodar was unique. Tully's really responsible for Damodar.
Bad guys are my favorite. They're always more interesting. I just tried to make them look as mean and scary as possible.
The dwarf was an interesting one to do, because everybody has a vision in their head, especially people who have played D&D, of what a dwarf is supposed to look like.
We made his armor and everything found pieces, so everything's dented and rusted, and he'll pick up whatever he finds lying around or whatever he knocks over in the alleyways that he hangs out with.
I saw him with this red burly beard, silly helmet. He's a bald dwarf. He's got this little piece of hair on the top of his head, and he hates when his helmet gets knocked off. Knock off Elwood's helmet, you're in trouble.
You shouldn't have done that.
And he's just got to be filthy. He's this mercenary dwarf. He gets thrown at a bars. He goes on adventures. He sleeps in garbage. So his chainmail's a little ripped. He's just a disgusting dwarf. With Norda, she's the elven tracker ranger. And I had seen this book about these robots, and it was actually Anne Flagella, the co-producer, who said, why doesn't Norda's armor go something like this? And I said, that's a great idea. So we talked to Tully about it. He loved the idea, and he made this sleek drawing. It was the first one.
Norda's armor, sort of like a Art Deco medieval mix. We wanted to come up with a look that wasn't recognizable as a historic period in human culture because none of that existed in this world.
It's Dungeons & Dragons, it's the first one. I hope everybody likes it so we can have as much fun and go do a sequel. And so what I'm going to do is spend my concentration on making this movie as good as it can be.